Good evening, friends. Welcome to the India International Center. Today, four or five of us will be presenting summary of our papers on state of the media in India. This is by no means a complete picture. This is an ongoing project of the IIC. In February 2022, the IIC set up 14 sectoral policy groups. One of them was on the media. There are others on agriculture, economy, history writing, so on and so forth. And it asked people to explore various aspects of that sector uh, and discuss what is the state of affairs in that particular sector, in our case, the media, and what can be done or what is possible to do. So this, as I said, is the media group. Not all our members are present here. The person who wrote a paper on the state of the media in Jammu and Kashmir, Anuradha Bhasin, is in the US and can't present her summary of her paper here. Similarly, R. Srinivasan, who's written a paper on corporatization of the media, has had to go to Chennai because of the cyclone, and his aged parents are there so with no electricity and telephone connection, so he's gone to restore those. But the summary of his paper will be read out by one of our colleagues. So as I said, this is just the first of such presentations. We are not presenting detailed papers. Everybody will present 10 minutes a summary of what they've written. And the idea is that people like yourselves who are journalists themselves or public intellectuals will comment and suggest changes which will be incorporated in the papers. So it's a limited exercise. It is not the entire face of the media that we are analyzing today. With that, I hand over to the moderator of this session, Mr. Anant Nath, Editor-in-Chief of the Caravan.
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you for that introduction. So as everybody here is, I'm sure, extremely well versed, the kind of environment that media is operating in, it's not just a changing face of media. Media is obviously, we've all seen how it has changed in the last 5 to 10 years. And there are, of course, many imperatives that are influencing that change. Political, non-political. So right from the way state has been interacting with media, the coercive action that state has been taking through various means, to the legislative environment under which media is operating. We have seen a slew of bills that have been introduced in the last few years, all of which will have a deep adverse impact on online media, on print media. Last month, the broadcast regulation bill was introduced. So the government has sort of tried to create a full web of legislation over and above already existing fairly cumbersome, fairly intrusive system of laws which have been in place forever, and which this government has, of course, used very effectively. The criminal bills, the criminal laws that they've used for muzzling free speech, for intimidating journalists and media organizations. And beyond the political spectrum, there are, of course, far more equally important changes that, from the business side, from the way media is consumed, the financial pressures under which most media organizations operate, which is heavily dependent on, traditionally, on revenues, a significant part of which has come from government, and government is, of course, all governments have used their, whatever means at their disposal to control media, and more so in the last few years, which is creating further pressures under which media is operating. And of course, the digital evolution has itself created both challenges and opportunities. Opportunities, of course, of reaching far higher audience, reaching audience with multiple new formats, which has required journalists to change the way they look at media, look at news. Of course, I mean, these are all things that have been in operation in the last 20 years. But all of it, while it has created opportunity, it has also posed challenges, because the online media we have seen is not the one that rewards serious journalism easily. So whilst we have, expanded the net of people who are consuming news, it has come at a cost with lower attention span, prioritizing content which is superficial, superfluous, and maybe not the one which is most, given to foregrounding the serious issues, which is itself had a fairly, one can say, debilitating effect on the way people consume, news and I mean news beyond politics as well. And lately, of course, we've seen how AI has added another level of complication. So there are many multiple facets, from financial to digital to laws, state, and equally importantly, the way media's own conduct has been. The ethics of media, the way media ownership is sort of structured in the country, which itself leaves a lot more wanting from media's own conduct. So while we may point fingers at state, we might point fingers at the way judiciary is, conducting itself, but what is the introspection that media is doing on its own conduct at a collective level? So these are all facets that are important, and we're all seeing, we're living in a time where every day we are questioning which direction are we moving in. It seems that the road has been downhill for quite a long time. The question is, what is the light at the end of the tunnel? And of course, there has to be light at the end of the tunnel. So I guess today we're going to hear a spectrum of speakers, who will all shed their light, shed their insights, and hopefully some solutions on at least a set of problems that media is undergoing. So I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers before handing the mic. We have Sukumar Muralidharan, who's going to talk about misinformation in the media. None of these panelists need any introduction, but I'm still going to do it. He's a columnist, journalist, educator, and a press freedom campaigner. He has been the chief of bureau of Frontline magazine earlier, and a professor at the School of Journalism at Jindal Global University. Sanjay Kapoor, the editor of Hardnews, very well known for his investigative journalism, exposed corruption through his reporting over the years, and also was the general secretary of Editors Guild of India. Bharat, the former founding editor of Mail Today and the executive editor of Hindustan Times, and now he's currently the South Asia editor of 360 Info, an academic wire service based at Monash University. Poornima, the chief of the political editor and chief of bureau at Hindu Business Line, and a fairly extensive career in reporting on politics and reporting on government. She was earlier the chief of bureau at Mail Today as well, worked with Caravan for a short while with us, and H-Teen Pioneer. Mr. Borker, again, needs no introduction, convener of Prasar and known for his path-breaking, amazing documentaries, and also a trustee at IIC. And Suhas, who's not able to join us, the former editor of Hindu Business Line. So maybe I can start with Sukumar by giving the stage to you.
Thank you very much. So misinformation is a topic, and I think at the very beginning, let me just say that there are two phenomena. There's disinformation. I think we're used to thinking of them as distinct, disinformation and misinformation. So there is a difference in intent between these two, but I'm not sure that there is any difference in effect. So I think I will confine myself to misinformation. I'll use the term misinformation, but it's a broad term which includes both those situations. So time is short, so let me refer to a written text. Misinformation is an old problem that has acquired new dimensions in recent times. With the country about to enter election season, the problem is likely to emerge with a fresh prominence now. In 2009 and 2014, the Election Commission felt compelled to call media houses into urgent conferences prior to the election season to discuss the problem of paid news. Right? That was a problem at that time, paid news. Fake news had not yet entered the vocabulary. In 2019, the concern was with fake news. And now, quite conceivably, the issue could be of deep fakes. So it's a moving target. And every time we seem to have it in our sights, it mutates into something different and more complex. Yet it is not as if fake news is unique to the new media ecosystem. Misinformation driven by a political or a commercial agenda has always existed. There could be the suppression of certain facts under advertiser pressure, There could also be an incentive for papers or any kind of media outlet, news outlet, aligned with a particular political cause to put out information selectively to advance that cause, or even to invent spurious news for the same purpose. What is different about the current situation is, in part, quantitative. At one time, we used to look at the number of newspapers bought and sold every day. Now we look at the volume of bytes transacted over cyberspace. Data traffic over the internet is increasing in India today by the order of 20 to 25% every year. That would be for any economist a dream scenario, but for the media, and particularly the news media practitioner, it is a challenge. Along with the explosive growth of data usage, there is a fall in the average revenue realization on every unit transacted. Service providers are themselves struggling to keep their heads above water, barely turning in a profit. And there is today a real risk of internet services becoming a monopoly with all the implications for net neutrality and transparency that could entail. Right? Net neutrality is generally regarded as a value that we should preserve, but there's a serious threat to that from possible monopolization, also from the functioning of over-the-top services, OTT services. Different theme, but we can talk about it later. In her classic 1967 essay, Truth and Politics, the philosopher and political theorist Hannah Arendt made a distinction between factual and formal truths. Factual truths refer to observations of reality by living subjects. Formal truths, on the contrary, were part of received wisdom, which few would challenge. Nobody could question the formal truth that 2 and 2 made 4. But factual truth was always prone to challenge as being no more significant than an opinion, the record of one person's observation. When the same factual observation is recorded by numbers exceeding a certain threshold, it is raised to the status of a truth. In certain situations, that agreement could be tenuous, since it could be challenged by an equal mobilization of numbers on the other side. Truth and politics, Arendt conceded, had always been on rather bad terms with each other. And yet a shared perception of facts was, in a sense, essential to create a politics of reasonable consensus. We could consider two instances in recent years when the construct of the formal truth itself has been challenged. Case one, the US presidential election of 2020, which Donald Trump lost by a margin of 7 million votes, but refused to concede, ostensibly because the system had been rigged. Further details here are well known. The litigation from the Trump campaign was defeated in the courts, one petition after another, in all amounting to 62. While he attacked the system, his close political ally, Rudolph Giuliani, went after individuals, targeting election workers in the state of Georgia for shifting votes from the Trump column to Joe Biden's. One news channel in particular kept up the din about the election results being fixed, naming 2 voting machine manufacturers in particular for corrupting the process. So when you have such a situation, what is the recourse? The recourse is something called institutional truth. When you are unwilling to accept another person's factual truth, you either challenge him to trial by combat, which is what Rudy Giuliani did on the morning of January 6th when he led a mob to run riots through the US Congress, or you refer the matter to the institutions that are by law and consent and custom entrusted with that authority. So what has been the institutional response? The process of certification of the election proceeded with a few glitches, despite the insurrectionary conditions that Trump's followers created. In the days after, many of those who took part in the Capitol Hill riot have been criminally prosecuted. Trump himself faces prosecution for election interference in the state of Georgia for his effort to wheedle out a sufficient number of votes from the system to win the state. Giuliani faces a defamation suit from 2 election workers who he slandered, who since then had to deal with violent threats and harassment. He could be held liable for damages that could clean him out for life. And Fox News, the TV channel that was most vociferous in its partisanship for Trump, was sued for defamation by both the voting machine companies it had implicated in its stories of a rigged election. The damages claimed by one was well above $1 billion, but finally the Rupert Murdoch-owned network ended up settling for $780 million, the second highest libel settlement ever. So that was the institutional response. And what has been the political aftermath? Today, Trump is the prohibitive favorite to win the nomination of the Republican Party for next year's presidential election. He is also shown in current polling to be trouncing incumbent President Joe Biden in key battleground states. Trump's patronage of fake news and his assault on the institutional foundations of American democracy have clearly not cost him politically. Case 2 here is the film Kerala Story earlier this year. Not so much the content of the film as on the public and institutional dialogue that accompanied its release. Kerala is a state that has witnessed the whole life cycle of the love jihad conspiracy theory. From its early glimmers to its litigation before the higher judiciary, through to its formal investigation by the police, which established that no such thing exists. The Kerala Story, the film, was made on the premise that the theory still had many buyers, and the narrative accompanying its release, widely promoted by the producer and director, spoke of the film as a portrayal of the tragedies that 32,000 young women in Kerala had lived through after being lured into matrimony by men of the Islamic faith and trafficked into the service of global terrorism. The Kerala Story received a promotional boost from none less than the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It was also promised tax-free status in several states ruled by the BJP, but it was not about to be given a pass. Litigation before the Kerala High Court called for its screening to be stopped on grounds that it created ill will between communities and maligned the image of the state. The High Court refused to intervene, but in subsequent hearings before the Supreme Court, the producer and director were forced to disavow the figure of 32,000 and admit that the story pertained to 3 women. So the formal truth that the two figures are different by an order of magnitude of 10,000 had to be acknowledged. The film nonetheless went on to become a significant hit at the box office. Halfway through India's general election cycle in 2019, the publisher of an Indian news portal, this is the publisher of Scroll, wrote about fake news as an epidemic raging across the country. The Election Commission, a nominally autonomous body, had thought of regulatory responses and technological fixes, but with little success. The answer, the writer suggested, might lie in changing tack, treating the fake news epidemic as a public health problem, which called for both a technical response and a mass education program. The prospect of a mass education program to tackle fake news flounders on the old question, who will educate the educators? Assuming that the educator would have to function on a public mandate, why should any government that has its own interest in shaping the information space entrust it with that mandate? The epidemic of fake news could be understood in terms of a determined exercise in ensuring strength in numbers to capture the entire width of the gate. Now, there's a concept of news gate, a conceptual way of understanding what manages to get into news coverage, right? Of all the events that happen in any given time, how many of them make it to the status of news? So that's a news gate. So the whole enterprise is of capturing that gate, the entire width of that gate. Social media has led to journalists seeing themselves as disseminators rather than interpreters. And when the likelihood of earning audience clicks exerts a powerful influence on gatekeeping, traditional media may be drawn towards shedding older rules and emulating cyber world trends. Studies have shown that certain kinds of political figures and public personalities have a presumptive claim to the news gate. What they say and do becomes news, right? By a kind of consensus among news organizations. In India, the risk, of course, is that voices from the opposition, even when reasonably expressed, are likely to become fodder for primetime predators on news channels. That only makes the case for well thought out strategies of engagement more compelling. There could be a case made for a partnership between the older media and public authorities with a measure of independence and autonomy, such as the Election Commission and the higher judiciary. Algorithmic amplification is how social media operates. It's a game played on the terrain of the attention economy. How many eyeballs are you able to capture? How can you use that claim to eyeballs to maximize your revenue from advertising? And it involves securing the largest number of clicks on any piece of news. The contest has shifted in favor of fake news over the last decade or so, but the numbers game could be driven in favor of a reasonable appreciation of truth by sufficient effort from the other side. So I'll end with 4 propositions. The cyber world has a snowballing momentum that feeds on political polarization. Second, because of mutual distrust between two sides of this kind of polarized contest, both seek to portray the other as fake news. In this contest for attention, force of numbers is key, and coordination is also very important. If key actors in civil society and the political leaders speak up from platforms that ensure they are heard, the cyber world campaign could well be deflated. So that's the strategic response. And there's also room for discussing legal and institutional responses, but my time is up, so I'll be very brief and I'll make only two observations. First is that the IT rules notified in February 2021, imposing a huge procedural burden on news platforms across all types of media, is not the appropriate response, right? The rules have been challenged for their constitutional validity, and the Bombay High Court is scheduled to rule on them on the matter on January 5th. Secondly, and finally, the institution of a cell within the Press Information Bureau as a single point arbiter of truth with the statutory power to determine that certain news items should be removed from the public sphere is also not the right response. It's another matter that we have to consistently oppose. So that's it from me. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Sukumar. Next speaker is Sanjay. He will be speaking about the state of investigative journalism in India.
Thank you for inviting me, Anant. It's good to be with friends at the moment. When I was coming here, I met a young journalist and I asked her, I told her that I was going to speak on investigative journalism. She said that she doesn't know what it is because she's largely data-driven. She goes by whatever is trending and go on Google, and that is what journalism is all about. So for her, data is more important than ferreting out information which people can't really get it. But in our days, things were very different. Investigative journalism was the heart and soul of the work we did. And there were people who used to inspire us. There was also an attempt to read up on the origin, the history of investigative journalism. And one of the characters who started very early was a woman. Her name was Ida Tarbell. Way back in the early 20th century, in the early 1905 or something, Ida Tarbell was a very angry, inquisitive, and determined journalist. She was angry with the richest man in the world, John Rockefeller, and she wanted to expose him. And that is when she started ferreting out information that Mr. Rockefeller did not want it to come out in the open. And he also had the benefit of the political class which was on his right side. But having said that, in those days, journalists weren't killed. I mean, they would be allowed to do pretty much what they wanted to do. And Ida Tarbell, in a series of articles in a magazine called McClure's, took apart Rockefeller to an extent that the company, the Standard Oil Company, which was the company owned by Rockefeller, was split up into many parts. And that is what the triumph of journalism is all about. And that time there was this recognition when it came to upholding public morality against predatory capitalism. You need absolutely intrepid, fact-based, and journalism which can look the administration, the establishment in the eye, and say what it wants to do. This was considered to be one of the bases for nation building, a fact which did not elude our leaders in 1947 when we gained independence. I remember reading about, much before my birth, but in fact, reading about how Nehru used to encourage, although he didn't like very nosy journalists, but his son-in-law, Feroz Gandhi, conspired, connived with journalists to, expose the Mundra scandal. And my former editor, Mr. Rusi Karanjia, with whom I worked for long years, he was one of those who used to be with Feroz Gandhi. And that exposure led to the arrest of Mundra. That too happened not too far away from here in Claridge's Hotel. So those kind of things that were considered as critical for nation building, and they were encouraged by Nehru in those days, because I think the belief was that if you have free journalists, if journalists can go around and ask questions, then you have a more accountable society, more accountable government. Because in the absence of that, you could be in a situation where you may not have people in power to face any kind of questions or be accountable to the people. So that was one of the motives why Mr. Nehru thought that journalism had to be protected. People who pursue journalism had to be protected. Didn't have to face allegations of being prostitutes or being called, being on the other side, like a Godi media. The truth was that there were people who decided that they had to write, and they wrote about it. So there were, I think, a whole spurt of anti-establishment writing which used to take place. So subsequently, this process continued. I mean, it happened less so during Indira Gandhi's time, but it kind of gained momentum whenever you had a coalition government in the 90s, I remember. Things got slightly unstable, but it was a good time for journalists. I remember in 1991, I broke something called the Jain Hawala scandal. And that was a scandal that had a list of practically all the top leaders, including the former prime minister, a former president, and you name them. I mean, there were 64 odd names of the top bureaucrats, top ministers who were there. And the fact that I could expose it was primarily a reflection of how the government used, how the society used to function. There were threats. It's not that there weren't threats. I mean, I was told that you have to be very careful about when you go and drop your children to the bus stop, or you go somewhere, you have to be careful. But nothing that kind of scared not only me, but many others who followed the story and did it remarkably well, including some people who filed a PIL. They all managed to do it. Primarily because I think there was a recognition that the people who were corrupt, who hands were found on the till, should be taken to task. I mean, they should be made accountable. And that continued for a while till the time, the corrupt prevailed, and everybody who had anything to do with the scandal managed to get its case overthrown out of the court. There were other cases also. There were other journalists who did remarkably well. We had a story on Bofors, which took place in the 80s. Mr. Chitra Subramaniam followed up the story, which was first broken by the Swedish radio. Mr. N. Ram of the Hindu also followed it up. It got a bit complicated thereafter, but the media played a very big role in that. And all this was allowed to take place in a country like ours, a democracy where there was space for it. But I don't know whether something like that could really be possible in these times. And similarly, there have been number of other incidents. I'm just giving you a snapshot about this long journey that I've been part of it, including the 90s and subsequently the happenings in Gujarat, which we were covered, the Gujarat riots, what really happened. And the country is still struggling, trying to find answers to many things. But that's how journalism continued to be challenged, and I think investigative journalism was always seen to be a way out to find answers to intractable issues. And we could carry on like this on many, many issues, but at some stage we have to figure out how much more to speak on investigative journalism, because what is really happening now is because of all the issues that Anant has raised. And despite the fact that his enterprise, the Caravan, shows great amount of adventure and character in taking up stories that nobody else does, is becoming more and more difficult to expose government corruption. It's becoming far more difficult to talk about matters which the government may not want to talk about it. I mean, there are stories that show up for a short while, and unlike in the past, there used to be extensive follow-ups in other newspapers and publications, that you don't hear anything taking place at all. Not in the parliament. The courts are also rather lackadaisical. And if you commit to the folly of finding out from anything that 40 kilometers away from Delhi about even big scandals, bigger stories, even Rafael for that matter, in a place like Meerut or whatever, you would find that people just don't know about it. Most of the stories which could be subversive in the reckoning of the government, or they express or manifest dissent, they do not go deeper beyond Delhi, and that too maybe around 2 kilometers of India International Center. So that has been a rather big tragedy for Indian journalism, tragedy for those who make a living out of asking questions, and that is unlikely to change, because I believe that investigative journalism cannot take place till the time you have institutional protection, till the time you have a democracy which works, because you cannot think of having anything more in a society which is trying to uh, copy Russia and not something which is democratic. And that is where I think the major challenge lies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjay. Can I ask Mr. Borker to now talk about future of Prasar Bharati and public broadcasting in India? Very important.
Yeah, I want to begin with the two caveats that now it's 27 years, 2023, when Prasar Bharati came into being, and Prasar Bharati is not the public service broadcaster, but a pretender and an obedient mouthpiece of the government of the day, and no way even remotely near the BBC, which repeatedly is being talked of right from Nehru's time. And the other point which I want to raise is that essentially there are three conditions to fulfill the mandate of a public service broadcaster, which are totally missing. Independence guaranteed by appropriate structures. Second, that's zero. Financial independence, guaranteed funding, that's zero. Accountability to the public through parliament, that is zero. And the Prasar Bharati talks of threefold mandate to inform, educate, and entertain, but it's going nowhere. There are reference points, of course. Apart from the BBC in UK, there is the ABC in Australia, the CBC in Canada, the NHK in Japan, and the South African Broadcasting Corporation in South Africa. Now, I just want to flag the social contract which has been broken. Public service broadcasting social contract refers to PSB's role in democracy, primarily its obligations to inform the public and scrutinize government. The notion of a contract, however, entails the exchange of rights and obligations for mutual benefit. In this exchange, PSB enjoys the rights to free expression and broadcast, and it is obliged to do fair and accurate coverage, providing citizens with the information they need to perform their roles as citizens. In May 2014, after the Modi government was sworn in, the then new Minister for Information and Broadcasting is on record to have promised to give Prasar Bharati full autonomy. The minister said the days of government fiefdom were over. Prasar Bharati would be restructured to resemble BBC, not only in administrative terms, but in terms of editorial freedom, parliamentary accountability, and its internal control over manpower. But nearly 9 years later, Prasar Bharati is on a tight leash. Forget Man Ki Baat, which broadcast its 107th episode last month on 26 November. It is ironic and a reflection of our times that the promoters of an institution attack the mother model of their creation. Prasar Bharati was to be modelled on BBC. BBC was under severe attack by the government of India for alleged omissions and commissions. It is alleged that GOI's retaliatory targeting with raids on BBC offices in New Delhi and Mumbai by Indian revenue officials was the aftermath of the release of the BBC documentary India, the Modi Question. BBC was accused by the Indian government of a continuing colonial mindset, pushing a particular discredited narrative and propaganda and anti-India garbage disguised as documentary. Over all these 27 years, the Prasar Bharati Act has not been implemented fully. A truncated Prasar Bharati has been set up so that it cannot function independently of the government. Critical sections 13, 14, and 15 of the Act remain unimplemented to this day. The politico-bureaucratic nexus is fully responsible for this. The PB Act section 13 envisaged the constitution of a 22-member parliamentary committee to supervise Prasar Bharati on behalf of Parliament. Its members are to be from both houses of Parliament through proportional representation. As the former CEO of Prasar Bharati put it succinctly, no government has, however, set up this committee as it does not want to give up powers and allow Prasar Bharati an opportunity to explain. The Babus insist that he or she alone is responsible to Parliament and therefore he or she can summon officials anytime for any reason. Even section officers exercise these powers quite vicariously, and the whole idea is to grill the officers of Prasar Bharati, Doordarshan and AIR to question every act of theirs until they succumb to the ministry. Section 14 and 15 of the Prasar Bharati Act require the setting up of a broadcasting council, which has again not been done. The PB board is to be a professionally managed body to effectively guide the organization. There has been no transfer of ownership and management of assets and HR to make PB financially and administratively autonomous of the government. Under Section 10 of the Prasar Bharati Act, Prasar Bharati is to set up its own recruitment board to ensure complete autonomy of the selection process and non-interference in appointments by the government. Nothing was done until July 2020, but a person with known RSS links was appointed as the chairman, compromising its autonomy. He is Jagadish Upasane, who heads Bharat Prakashan, which publishes Panchajanya and Organizer, which are regarded as mouthpieces of the RSS. In January 2014, the Sam Petroda-led expert committee on Prasar Bharati, on which I was a member of the Prasar Bharati Government Relationship Committee, had recommended a comprehensive manpower audit of Doordarshan and All India Radio. No action was taken on this until November 2018, when the PB board sought the assistance of Ernst & Young India for the audit project. In February 2021, findings of the audit project were out. Interestingly, the findings used the BBC benchmark for comparison in the audit. Prasar Bharati had nearly half of 25,000 workforce employed in the engineering division, whereas the corresponding figure for BBC was a little over 10%. PB's content team had less than 20% of the workforce, while BBC's content team accounted for 70%. PB's manpower costs accounted for over 60% of its expenses. In case of BBC, it was just around 30%. Most critically, under Chapter 3 of the Prasar Bharati Act, the board has to have its own fund for its function. Part of the funds has to come from the property and assets and that the central government would transfer to the board. But even after 27 years, no transfer of property to the board has taken place. Lack of its own funds has emasculated the board. The board is at the mercy of the government for funds to even perform elementary functions. Now, I just want to quote and end with this. This is from a UNESCO document. Neither commercial nor state-controlled public broadcasting's only raison d'etre is public service. It is the public's broadcasting organization. It speaks to everyone as a citizen. Public broadcasters encourage access to and participation in public life. They develop knowledge, broaden horizons, and enable people to better understand themselves by better understanding the world and others. Now, you mentioned, Anant, about what is the solution. I think the only solution is a regime change. Thank you.
That may not happen in near future, it seems now. Okay, Poornima, can I invite you? Poornima will be speaking on the decreasing access of journalists to the government and the legislature.
Yeah, so I'm sort of focused more on the everyday sort of practice of journalism and how we as journalists see the government's sort of actions in terms of a strategy, and I see three clear strands here. Uh, One is an attitude which is reserved for people who are likely to acquiesce to the government's apparent wish to be glorified. So this is a sort of an unstated quota system that has evolved to reserve top jobs, best salaries, and access to information, which would constitute positive publicity for the government. So those who have not yet become part of this quota system fall into two categories. One are the outright activists, critics, who are becoming the other side of this extremely polarized public discourse. Uh, and they are of course dealt with an iron hand. They use central investigating agencies, they use police forces, they slap sedition charges, which of course have been put a stop to by the Supreme Court of late. uh, but I'm more concerned about the second category, which is the middle of the road, still independent journalists. There's a vast multitude of them who are not yet part of what is called the Godi media. So while for the bitterest critics and activists, journalists, the strategy is to wield the stake, use central investigating agencies, lodge FIRs, hound them out of their jobs if they're still fortunate enough to have them, and shut down the platforms that a vast number of them have taken to using. There is the second category of non-co-opted journalists still trying to be independent. And the focus of my paper is on those people who have not yet been co-opted, who are trying to do everyday job of a journalist. So if the government is saying, okay, we have written off, the banks have written off 10.6 lakh crore of loans in the last 5 years, we try to figure out, have they been waived off? No, they say it's not been waived off, they've been written off. So what really is the difference? No, we're trying to recover all these loans. So what is the extent of recovery? 1 rupee out of every 5. But to get to that understanding, to get to that figure, you need to talk to people. You need to reach out to people. You need to get that statistic. This is the everyday work that we do. But the strategy in our case is to make us irrelevant. And my case is that this is literally being done by starving us of our oxygen for the craft. Primary information that is our job to process and disseminate through news reports, editorials, and commentary, etc. The practice that is sought to be normalized is for communication to be one way and to disallow cross-checking and verification of this one-way flow of information. This practice obviously facilitates only that communication which originates from the government and not the information that is sought by the journalists. So, in other words, only information that the government wants to make public is going to be made available, and not the information that is relevant for assessing whether the government is functioning in public interest, which is the basic function of news. For one-way communication, there is no dearth of it. There's plenty of information available in the form of press handouts, visual bites, dispersed through social media. But that doesn't serve the purpose of journalism, such as digging out what is the extent of write-offs, how much is being recovered, for which you need to do everyday digging, you need to do everyday talking to people, you need to ferret out information that the government wants to hide. You need to talk to people, and it's people inside the government which will give you information. So if you're covering health ministry, somebody will tell you this particular health minister spent 30 lakhs in redecorating his office but never turned up even for a day in 6 months. or why somebody is not attending parliament. These are things that that information that comes out from within the government. We are not necessarily shouting from rooftops. A lot of these journalists are not activists. They're simply trying to do their job. And this paper is chiefly concerned with how journalists who want to practice their everyday journalism truthfully, authentically, how we are being stonewalled. There is a systematic manner in which access to information is being curtailed. You can get their press handouts, you can get their bites. They're all there on social media. Prime Minister is on social media, very active. So and you see stories like how the Prime Minister is sort of evolving, and his Twitter account is now sort of suiting is tailored to appeal to young people. These kind of stories are done with it. They're not really news stories. They're just sort of analyzing whatever is put out, which the government wants to put out. That's not really what I would call authentic journalism. But what is being done to us is stonewalling, blocking entry into government offices, parliament, denying access to official channels which can be used to verify information, and using surveillance to check who a journalist is talking to, etc. No one in the government or in political parties. Earlier, it was quite the practice to have an informal chat over the phone, but this is an absolute no-no in the post Pegasus and so on. Nobody talks to you on phone. Earlier they would say use WhatsApp. Increasingly, then they would say please use Telegram to call us. Recently, I had an encounter with an old source of mine in the BJP, whom I sent a message on Telegram saying, "Can we talk privately?" And he was so scared. He called me to a particular place, and then he said, "Don't send these kind of messages to me. God knows how they'll be interpreted." But I said that was on the Telegram and there was nothing to it. He said, "No, but everything is being read. Everything is being seen." So it's a very effective way to prevent journalists from accessing, authenticating information that they believe to be in public interest, but might be construed as anti-government and so on. So let me describe what is happening to an important avenue for news gathering, which is Parliament. Access to Parliament is important because roughly for 4 months in a year during budget, monsoon and winter session, Parliament House is the main hub of information concerning executive and legislative business. The government as well as the opposition parties function from Parliament. All routine press conferences are conducted in the Parliament House. And the scrutiny and cross-verification of information which happens through informal interactions with ministers, MPs and members of opposition parties are all done in these precincts. And a very important source is MPs who are members of various departmental standing committees. They have a lot of information which may not finally make it to their committee reports, but is invaluable as inputs in a newspaper story. Curtailing access to Parliament is tantamount, in my opinion, to effectively crippling genuine news reporting. But now there is a sort of an informal blockade that started. It started during the pandemic, and it is continued. It's sort of being used as an excuse to block us from entering Parliament. So the practice was, Prahlad Joshi at the beginning of the lockdown said that no passes will be allowed and so on. And nobody objected at that time. During the 2 years of pandemic, we all covered Parliament through virtual sessions and so on. But that practice has, to limit the number of media persons who would be allowed entry in Parliament has now been normalized. So there's a pattern now of isolating Parliament and parliamentarians from media scrutiny. In the new Lok Sabha, the media enclosure is so far from where the proceedings are held. Earlier, in the earlier building, the logistics were such that you could peer down and have a 180-degree of the Lok Sabha or Rajya Sabha, whichever house you were covering, and you could figure out what was going on. In the new building, you cannot do that. It's all very far from you. And in any case, after the pandemic is over, every access is allowed. journalists are still not being issued passes. Central hall passes have been stopped. The practice of sitting and chatting with people, getting informal access to MPs, ministers, parliaments. So as of now, less than 150 correspondents are being allowed access to parliament during the sessions, that too on a sessional or a weekly basis. No, even people who hold permanent passes are not being allowed entry through the sessions or through the year, which was the practice earlier. Besides Parliament, there is also the official machinery which functions from various government offices. There is, I would say, growing evidence of ministers routinely telling their officers not to interact with the press. The effort now is to prevent journalists from entering government offices altogether. Communication over the phone, as I described earlier, is generally assumed to be under surveillance, and personal interactions are sought to be curtailed. Surveillance cameras have been installed in all government offices, visitors' rooms, so the journalist seeking access and the officers giving it is easily identified. Information gathering is additionally curtailed through barring access to journalists, although altogether, unless one has a specific appointment with an officer. So the thumb rule earlier was that if you're an accredited correspondent with the Press Information Bureau, you can enter any government office, government building except the PMO or the Defense Ministry, which was understood to, in general, as a heightened kind of security measure. But that practice is now being replicated in all other government departments. In the Finance Ministry, for instance, after the budget presentation, it was the usual practice for journalists to interact with officials to understand the intricacies of the budget. That practice has now been stopped. The ministry now says that there is a procedure on to streamline the entry of journalists. And journalists, even those accredited with the PIB, can now enter the ministry only after prior appointment with the officers. Why I'm underlining this is because the practice of allowing journalists to meet officials only after they have the said official has been identified goes against the very grain of news gathering, where source anonymity and protection is crucial, especially in an environment of suspicion and surveillance where officers and even ministers are routinely reprimanded for sharing information with the media. This practice effectively puts a stop to free flow of information. And it's getting worse. Now, we are given to understand that there is the PIB accreditation itself is going to be restricted. The PIB now has new set of guidelines for grant of accreditation. This new policy has an entire section about factors that can result in cancellation of accreditation of the journalist. For the first time, it specifies reasons and conditions that can result in the journalist losing accreditation. This new policy basically debars you from entering any office, meeting your sources, getting and verifying information, which the government of the day would not like to circulate. So I would say this along with the practice of the government using various draconian laws indiscriminately and using police and investigating agencies to intimidate journalists, an important trend to monitor, which is the focus of my paper, is how channels of information that can authenticate, verify, or question what is being put out by the government are effectively being blocked. So while one side of the story, which is the positive side, which is the only side that the government would like you to see, is being trumped up, social media, TV, etc., are heavily deployed to circulate the story and create narratives, whichever narrative the government would like you to believe, is being trumped up. The other side is there is a huge effort to shut down channels that question this one-way flow of information. My paper is an attempt to document this trend. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Very grim picture indeed, Poornima, and extremely worrying. But thank you for bringing it to the fore. Bharat is going to speak on the changing role of the editor in media. In some places, whether the editor has enough powers at all, I guess. So,
Thank you, Anant. So I'm talking about professional designation whose job description has changed beyond recognition. Those journalists who worked in mainstream media already know this, so I'm not going to say anything new for them, but those who are not journalists might find some interest in what I'm saying. An editor today not only oversees news operations, but also looks after marketing and revenue generation. This never used to happen earlier. This is the result of structural changes in the news business. Three factors have changed the role of the editor. One is the change in the hiring policy of editors. Which is the talent pool from where you hire editors? Number two, the impact of newspaper pricing on market expansion. And three, erosion of the ad revenue-based model of the news business. So what do I mean by hiring policy changes? Editors came from three different streams. They came from the stream of leader writers, people who wrote commentary, the so-called edits. Later on, many of them became eminent editors themselves. Or they came from the stream of correspondents, people who were political correspondents, financial correspondents, and then rose to become editors. And third, they came from the desk stream. They came from the sub-editing stream, people who are good at correcting grammar, giving headlines, etc. The dominant stream of hiring of editors today has shifted from the first two to the third one. Today, editors come from the desk stream. So the emphasis is on how good is the editor in packaging news. How good is he at giving headlines? How good is he at rewriting major stories? So the desk job has been elevated to the level of an editor. So editors are micromanaging the news pages in terms of their form and content, rather than looking at the big picture. And this is what is valued today. So this persona of the editor is less of a risk taker. This persona of the editor is also less sure of the direction of the polity, because that's a big question to which he or she has never addressed. This persona of the editor is also relatively politically conservative. And its source of prestige comes from the management and acceptability with the management, rather than from the team of journalists he or she leads. So in effect, today's editor has no distinct personality of his or her own. Nobody even knows the names of editors of major newspapers today. They're not mentioned anywhere. Who knows who's the editor of Times of India? You might know who the resident editor in Delhi is, but who really runs it? Who gives it direction? So editor has become a faceless apparatchik representing the management's interests rather than public interest. So this is what I meant by change in hiring policies. The second structural change that has come is change in the newspaper's economics. The unrealistic pricing of newspapers when Murdoch took over London Times in 1981, because he wanted to grab the market from the Telegraph, was followed in India as well. The Telegraph-Times war continued till 1996 or so. In India, Times of India was the first one to decide to follow Rupert Murdoch and started a price war in 1994, which ultimately resulted in the paper on most days being 1 rupee subscription cost, and on Wednesdays 2 rupees. Times of India was the market leader in Bombay. It wanted to enter Delhi, become the market leader in Delhi, which was really, HT was the city paper, Hindustan Times. So this price war started. Everybody joined in this price war. So what did this price war do? It reduced the revenue from larger print runs, because subscription in any case never covered the cost of production of a newspaper. But with the prices coming down to 1 rupee for those days, a 36-page paper, meant that the larger the print run, the greater your loss. So you needed really deep pockets to stay in the market. But what it also did, so it's finished off, small competitors were finished off. What it also did was it expanded the market for English language newspapers. And this it did in two ways. One, many households from one newspaper household became two newspaper households, because earlier you were paying 2 rupees 50 paisa for a newspaper. Now for 2 rupees you could get two newspapers and save 50 paisa every day, and the rest you recovered from Raddi at the end of the month. And the second thing it did was that regional language newspaper households started buying English language newspapers, because English is seen as an aspirational language. So you bought, let's say, Bharat Times, and for 1 rupee extra, a marginal cost of 1 rupee, you get Times of India as well. Or you bought Hindustan, you got Hindustan Times as well. So the market expanded in these two ways. Yet another development around the same time was the availability of cheap printing technology. Earlier, printing machinery had to be imported, and there was a lead time of 3 years before you got a 36 form machine or whatever. It would come to Bombay port, it would be transported to Delhi, there would be accidents on the way, another 6-month delay, etc. So these machines became available, they were much cheaper. So this again led to new editions being launched. Newspapers that were limited to tier 1 cities went to tier 2, tier 3 cities. So just to understand this expansion, Times of India in 1990s has 2 editions, Mumbai and Delhi, Bombay then. Today, Times of India has 55 editions. HT Delhi was just 1 edition. Today it has 6. It had gone up to 10, it shut down 4. Dainik Bhaskar, which had 1 edition in 1958, has 65 editions. So these are district level editions and so on and so forth. Minor changes here and there. Now this also became possible because of growth of technological breakthroughs. Initially fax machines, then improved telecom. You could transmit pages, you could make pages at one go and send it to all the editions. They could make minor modifications there, etc. But this market expansion was not because of brilliant editors. It was underwritten by marketing directors who brought in more ad revenue. And this had the most severe consequences for the job of the editor. Marketing directors, because they were credited for market expansion and extra revenue that was coming in, started exerting control over news content. Instead of selling news to the readers, marketing directors wanted to sell reader profiles to the advertisers. That my readers are people with this kind of income profile, they can buy your goods and therefore advertise with us. You would remember the Times of India owner gave an interview to New Yorker and said that he sees newspaper essentially as a vehicle for advertisement, not for news. News is secondary, it's a vehicle for advertisement. At one point, Harish will bear me out, we were in Times of India together those days. Times of India started giving dual designations to the editors. You would be called Editor Delhi and Brand Manager. Editor Delhi and in charge of whatever, marketing. So the demand actually from marketing directors was that you cater to a certain income group, what are called socioeconomic categories, A1, A2, or broadly referred to as the middle class. And rest you could ignore. Who's interested in a fire in Yamuna Pushta, we were told, right, for South Delhi. What happened because of this is editors became adjunct functionaries of marketing departments. Editors then chose either to become brand ambassadors, where they would rub shoulders with the hoity-toity and say that, we are exactly like you. There's no threat to the establishment or to you from us. Or editors who could not become brand ambassadors of their newspapers, they became liaison persons. They helped their owners expand their business. You want to go into the power business? We'll get you a license. You want a coal mine? I'll get you a license. You're importing machinery? I'll talk to customs and see to it that you don't have any problems. They also became very powerful editors. One doesn't need to name them. Journalists know who they are. So these structural changes that were taking place facilitated 2 things. One, they created a nexus between editors and the media and corporates. Because you're totally dependent on ads, you didn't want to go against the corporates. And 2, because of liaison work, etc., and because people trying to expand their businesses outside the media, between the media and the state, also a nexus developed. So as a result, editors saw their affirmation not from their readers, but from recognition from corporates. So radio tapes is an example of that. Or they saw affirmation from the state. The rush that used to be there to get Padma Awards, get nominated to Rajya Sabha, get nominated as Prasar Bharati CEO, or become Vice Chancellor of a journalist university being run at the state, are all sort of part of that malaise. So close to the management rather than the journalists, editors saw a massive hike in salaries. And they spearheaded the contract system in most newspapers, which started from the late 70s onwards. So as a result of that, editors who used to be members of professional trade unions like DOJ, All India Federation of Working Journalists, etc., left the trade unions completely. And they distanced themselves from working journalists and their concerns because they identified with the management. They had been bought out. So a sort of schism took place between editors and journalists, and that became final with the association uh, from the journalists. So they didn't think they were covered by the Working Journalists Act, but that's a misconception. Contract system is not covered by Working Journalists Act. It's also a misconception, and this was laid to rest in Hartosh Singh Bal versus Open Media case. I suggest people read it. You still, if you're on contract, you still have that protection. Hartosh got 6 months back wages as notice period, which they should have given, plus a compensation of 10 lakh. So, but anyway, editors did, instead of coming under the Working Journalists Act, chose to be with the management. So what has become of the editor today? I think editors have become more market-centric. The top line or the gross profit and loss of the media company decides what actions that is it that editors take. Editors have a revenue generation responsibility, as the unrealistic pricing makes it even more onerous for them to keep the enterprise running. Add to this the ad revenue being shared with electronic media. There's a growth of electronic media, and newspaper readership shrinking because the first source of news is no longer newspapers, it's social media. So editors now had to carve a new revenue stream, or help the management in carving new revenue streams. This was done through organizing sponsored events to rope in advertisers. And these events make enormous amounts of profit. Just to give you an idea, a group I used to work for, the 3-day conclave way back in 2007 had led to a net profit after expenses of about 7 crores. The owner was so thrilled that all the editors were taken to Bangkok for 3 days to decide how can we organize more such events. So you have summits, conclaves, leadership awards, best businessman, best entrepreneur, best banker, best chief minister, best restaurants, best hotel, etc. awards as a source of revenue. So editors now needed excellent relations both with corporates, because you have to get sponsorship for events, advertisers, as well as the political leadership and the government leadership and the bureaucracy, because they are the ones who will grace the occasion, and this will be sold as an opportunity to interact with these leaders to people attending those events, and that's how you make money. So this new disease, eventitis, is what most editors today have to willy-nilly suffer from, or have to sort of say, all right, I also want to be infected by it if I have to survive. So as a result of this, opinion pages have been opened up as an influence peddling exercise to political leaders, party spokespersons, corporate honchos. Most of them ghostwritten articles for buying goodwill with them, because you'll need them for your events. I only have to remind you that one pink paper had a big event planned in 2014 in Bombay, and because the top leadership of the government then was unhappy with what their TV channel was doing, the Prime Minister refused to go to the event and announced it 24 hours before the event was to take place. 14 of his ministers also decided not to go, and the event collapsed. That's the kind of pressure the government can bring on people suffering from eventitis. Essentially, editors no longer enjoy the freedom they had earlier, except perhaps on municipal issues. Now, on municipal issues, I realized while running Mail today, even that is not true. Because the Delhi government, for example, has a huge ad budget, and it's gone up God knows how many times under Mr. Kejriwal. If they decide not to give you ads, that can affect your revenue stream pretty adversely. So can the role of the independent editor be salvaged? I don't think so, unless the news business reinvents itself and redefines itself. And unfortunately, there's a paucity of new ideas, and even a greater scarcity of entrepreneurs who will back new ideas. A lot of some ideas are being tried, but they find no backers at all. So as far as editors are concerned, I think their profession or their job is doomed. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharat. We had thought about reading Srinivasan's essay, but should we continue with that, or we have time, or should we open up to?
I think we should open up.
All right, okay. I think there are quite a few senior editors here, so I would probably start with an open house and ask, if there are, invite audience for questions on any of the topics or anything else that we might have sort of missed out. So,
Recording, so if you can pick up the mic.
yes, there's a hand there. If you could also identify yourself, and if the question is directed at any of the panelists, or if it's to the panel at large, then please specify. Is there a mic somewhere?
They have to pick this up. Yeah.
Maybe if you can use that mic, yes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sanjay Raj, founder of Vision India 2032. I've just come from Sikkim, where I've been handling the damage assessment and the rebuilding operations, which have fallen on deaf ears in this country. So moving aside from that, that would answer the other ones, what I think most of the panelists here addressed. My question is this. The last gentleman, Bharat, if I understood correctly, he said, what is the role of the editor? I think the larger question we are asking ourselves is, do we have responsible journalism that could be brought on to the next generations who sit behind the social media and then try to pass it off as news and reporting? That's one. And that's again to all of the journalists. Sanjay Kapoor has been in investigative journalism, and I think I fall in love with you for the romanticism of it. No, it was cynical to me to say of that. In order to have a responsible society, where are we moving? And what role is the journalism playing and can play in redefining the narrative, not only of a country, but also the humanity? And I'll stop that. Thank you.
So, no offense meant, but I'm always suspicious of adjectives being added to journalism, just as I'm suspicious of adjectives being added to democracy, real democracy, Western democracy versus local democracy. I think journalism does not need any adjectives. You would also talk of a responsible society, responsible behavior. This all smirks of an idea to control and shape journalism. It goes against the spirit of press freedom and freedom of speech. What is responsible journalism? Would you please define it?
I'll bring in three global events. One is the current pandemic. Two is the Xinjiang in China. And then three, as you all, of course, have the Modi media being served. So aren't those three enough for us to stand up against what is there in the general interest of the public itself and of our own evolution as well? Thank you.
I don't understand what those three examples mean, but we can discuss it later unless the chair permits you to explain. What does Xinjiang got to do with responsible journalism? Are you saying people are not reporting on what's happening in Xinjiang? Or whatever else? I mean, you have an agenda, so you're saying they define what is responsible journalism.
No agenda here at all. In fact, I'm one of the most neutral people that I can find.
So maybe just to sort of, I think, put a perspective to this debate is oftentimes the government mostly says this, and many times readers also say that why doesn't a certain media organization do some kind of positive stories? And that's where that's a convenient couch that is often used. And if I sort of maybe try and interpret what you're trying to say is that bring out the positive side of any policy making. And I guess the response, I can give a response from my end, our end, or the way we look at journalism is that the moment you're supposed to put that filter, that why isn't a certain media organization talking about the positive side of any policy making or positive side of national interest or positive side of anything, you have sort of put a layer of some kind of a censorship, certain kind of filter, which ideally a journalist or a media organization should not work under, because the primary job here is to report on stories. Primary job here is to have a certain sense of anti-establishment view about a certain affairs, because positive they can do themselves. They have their PR agency, they have their Twitter handles, they have their whatever social media handles they have to talk about the positive side. The reader, our responsibility is to the reader, and the reader wants to know whatever is not being said by them through official channel. So the layer has to be, the underwriting, the governing rule has to be to critique. But obviously not critique for the sake of critiquing, that's fair enough. But the moment you put a pressure of positive, you're sort of deviating, you're becoming a handle, you're becoming a sort of a handyman to whatever powers that may be. Yeah, Sanjay, I think there was a question directed to you.
I entirely agree with my fellow panelists about this. I think if you're talking about responsible journalism, this is again something that has to be clarified. But I would like to put in a layer that, the devaluation of the editor in most of the newsrooms have created a situation where many of the stories start getting in for reasons other than whether they are newsworthy or not. I think if the role of the editor, the position of the editor is strengthened, we would get back a whole lot of things which people are able to question now. So, but having said that, I don't agree with those people who are raising questions about responsibility because they themselves are not very responsible to how they conduct themselves. Thank you.
Okay, please.
I'm Ira Joshi, retired Principal Director General, All India Radio. Just because I've been in government from the Indian Information Service, so I've been in PIB, I've been in DAVP, I've been in AIR, I've been DD News also. So, what Suhasji was saying, that political parties, now the politically you are trying to see which media is for you and which is against you. My personal experience during my service years is that the same thing happens with whichever political party is in position. It does not matter whether it is Congress or BJP or any other party. Everybody has their favorites and everybody tries not to give, from DAVP, not to give ads to the opposition party media. So, there they are all equal. I would say that. And the question that he was saying, because of course in PIB we were dealing with this, though personally, at a personal level, I would also tell many journalists, many good ones were there obviously, but there were some who would just take the PIB copy and I would say, go and investigate whether it is right or wrong. So it is slowly that situation has reduced further, that less and less people are going deeper into the policy issues. But at the same time, I would say one thing, that if government has a policy, has announced a policy which benefits people, then I personally feel that whether it is private media or government media, it needs to be told to the people so that they can benefit. It is for the people. Whatever is wrong, of course, has to be told. But whatever is right, why should that be censored? That's my...
No, actually, I agree with you that when the powers that be are in the opposition, they have different language, and when they come to power, they have a different language, and that we have seen. Repeatedly, right from when the act was passed. So it's part of the whole system. What can you do?
In which case, regime change won't help. Huh?
There is some effervescence that people are getting fed up. So if there's a regime change, they would like to go back.
That is an opinion. I don't know. That's okay. That's an opinion.
It's a question from that gentleman. If you can come to one of the mics and ask the question.
Sorry, yeah. Good evening and thanks for the opportunity. When I joined BBC for a small stint when they started Indian language project, the marketing person who was heading the department, he said, when we are asking about his role, he, in very short span, in very short words, he said, I'm here to manage the business of journalism. So I have a comment to make, especially whatever you described, sir, that I guess there is a tone, negative tone about business and journalism. Why let's not accept that there is the situation? We want 30% raise, we want good lifestyle, we should earn nice money and should lead a really nice, interesting life. Then why we are hating about talking about commerce and relation of marketing and journalism department? I myself am a commerce master of commerce. I have a post graduation in commerce and as well as journalism. I have handled marketing department in very short span of time when it was my initial stage of career, and then for last 15 years I'm in television journalism. And I can see that we need to understand the business. It is a journalism is a business. Let alone leave the marketing and commerce related side. While English media never had viewership or readership as compared to the regional language, but still they are getting good money and good salaries. Have we ever questioned about our own salaries being into English journalism, that why our counterparts who are actually getting more circulation, audience and viewership, and they are getting for peanut, they are working for peanuts. We are talking about commerce, we are talking about marketing, and we are not talking about the scale of pay. So anything, I'm not getting into it. My basic question is, let's understand commerce, let's understand business. It is here to stay. We have to work, yes. I have myself, I was editor, executive editor of a Marathi news channel, and I was instrumental in arranging events and etc. Because they are going to get money for me when there are half dozen Marathi news channels in Maharashtra, and I want to sustain with the business, and I have to give good pay scale to my good talent, 20% at least per year. How can I afford to ignore this commerce side? That's my opinion, sir.
The task before me was basically to see how things have changed. I've described and I've analyzed how things have changed. I make no moral judgment about your organizing events or getting ads for your channel, etc. That's between you, your owners, and your journalists. As far as salary disparity is concerned, because it was considered that there would be such salary disparities, there was the Indian Working Journalists Act, under which wage boards were set up, which suggested that salaries should be in relation to circulation, etc., and the revenue generated. While I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of the English media owners implemented wage board initially. Later on, they also did not. The regional and the vernacular language owners never did. Don't do it even today. It cannot be the fault of the editor of a Marathi newspaper or Marathi channel to ensure that his journalists get good salary and not that of the owner. So, as an editor, did you ever then say, let's implement wage board? Because wage board salaries today are, virtually the same, if not higher than that of contract employees. Did any of the editors fight against the contract system? I am not aware of a single editor who's fought against it. Did any editor say that my journalists are protected under the Working Journalists Act? No. Did you know that if you sack an editor under the Working Journalists Act, you have to give him 6 months notice or salary in lieu of that? Does anybody follow that? No. So you can't say, we must understand commerce. Of course we must understand commerce. We must understand newspaper business. But we must also understand what the legal obligations of owners are, what the legal obligations and moral obligations of editors are. So mine was just an analysis saying how things have changed over the last 4 decades. I'm not making a moral judgment. I'm not saying X today is a bad editor and Y at that time was great.
You had these big Indian industrial magnates who were on the management side and owned the newspapers. And every morning, I know at 11 in the morning, they would have a policy meeting, and all the journalists were told, you will toe this line and you will write this and not this. And every newspaper had this policy. If any editor went against that, he was asked to resign or go somewhere else. He was not accepted. So government is stepping into their management shoes because the government has made this owners and management onerous. Now government has stepped into their shoes. So what do the journalists do? They suffer then, they're suffering now. There's no answer. They suffer then. because they could not go against the management and the owners of the newspapers. They had one policy. Every morning they had a policy meeting. This is their policy. You either write along our line or you do not write and go away, go elsewhere. So what do you answer to? No, it's a comment about the past and the present, and nothing has changed. It's the same. Only Chakravarti, Nikhil Chakravarti had the gumption to go against writing against the government, and he wasn't thrown out of his government house. None of the politicians threw him out because he found him very strong, including his wife, Renu Chakravarti, who spoke very well in parliament. So you all have to be strong. The voice has to be strong.
That's part of the reason why the newspaper, what is it called, the first union?
Yeah, you had the trade union.
The trade union movement of journalists started. Yeah,
Stood up against the power of the money bags.
but then there were splits and so on. It's weakened over time. Yes, there's no getting away from that fact. But one of the responses from the professional cadre of journalists was to organize, right? I mean, also there was the formation of the All India Newspaper Editors Conference and so on, which have all kind of over time weakened as bodies, as collective
Now I'm happy that
organizations.
the
But,
management has put a little bit to make them weaker. I'm happy about that.
Yeah, please.
Okay, I'm not a journalist. I'm just a reader of newspapers. And I find this kind of gloom which is emanating from the panel is getting to be a bit much, because we still look for, I mean, there's still some excitement in the papers. We all consume the media because we still find things there. I mean, you have the editorial on 370 in the Hindu, which is remarkable. I mean, it's actually taken on not just the government stance, but also what the Supreme Court bench has completely missed. And it's really fine, critical commentary on both the judgment as well as in 370. And then you have the Pegasus expose. I mean, it's still possible to do hard news, it's still possible to do exposes. Maybe it's done under different conditions, and you have to explore those possibilities. I mean, if you need a coalition of international journalists to do it, so be it. But you have to think about how to move forward rather than saying, nothing can be done on. And I suppose there are many other examples. I've just quoted two because and I couldn't understand why we are not evaluating those possibilities as well.
Yeah, we may sound a bit gloomy, but the fact of the matter is that things are gloomy. Fundamentally, if you have to go for foreign outfits to do something which was coming naturally to us, if you're going to the coalition of international journalists to do stories that would normally elude you there, or for that matter, look at much of the kind of, Hindu is just one example you're giving for Article 370. But if you have bulk of the newspapers going gaga over whatever the courts have done, no criticism whatsoever, CGI. So it ends up giving legitimacy to everything that is being stated. One editorial by a single newspaper may be good for the health of the country, but nothing beyond that. So I'm not sure whether things are looking up, primarily because, as somebody very rightly pointed out, you have fewer people reading the newspaper despite the fact whatever the figures are being given. You have, if you go to the airport or any line, you won't find any person holding a newspaper in his hand. Why is that happening? So the influence and the clout of the newspapers is dwindling. Largely, you have to disengage from newspapers and look at how the TV channels are being perceived and how the online media is being perceived. Whether you have to club everything together and see whether they collectively have greater influence. So these are issues I think at some stage the people who make a living out of this have to really understand.
Yes, can I just add, it's not about gloom and doom. It's about the degrees of freedom that newspapers had or journalists had, how they've changed over time. I mean, after all, during the emergency, the media played a stellar role, especially the Indian Express. Even the much maligned Girilal Jain gave hell to Rajiv Gandhi, writing critically about him, his style of functioning, etc. Those things were possible then. And those things are not possible now. So yes, Hindu has been very brave in writing this editorial, but where are the others? And not only on the issue of 370, but whatever has been happening in Kashmir for last 4 years. Where are the reports of people suffering? Where are the reports of people's anger? Nowhere there. This would not have happened. The degrees of the degree of freedom that editors had and journalists had has shrunk. So one has to understand the reasons for that and then try and change those reasons. He has summarized by saying regime change. But from regime change, a lot of things can follow. I'm not saying that is the only big change you need. Sometimes that's the big change you need, but there could be a lot of other changes. People can be brave, but they are afraid to be brave. So why is that happening? We need to understand that.
Yeah, no, I was saying that for one, that editorial, you had all the papers sort of slapping the Prime Minister's huge op-ed piece, which obviously was not written by him, but written by somebody else, but everybody carried it. One is that. The second is that having been in the media, the basic, I mean, people talk about positive and negative journalism. Basic tenet of journalism is not being practiced. So either you have activism happening on the other side. I mean, I'm very uncomfortable with this whole whole sort of binary that is emerging. One set of people who are very, very critical, transient, and it sort of gets polarized that way. And then you have the government and the Godi media, and there is no space for doing nuance, critical, considered reportage. It's just very, very difficult to do it. And how it's being those spaces, like Bharat is saying, are shrinking, and there's not even, like Sanjay was pointing out, there's not even a thing of news is being reduced to content, and people are not even looking for stories now. They're just looking for, some prime minister's Twitter account, how well it's doing and how the language has changed. That's the story, uh, you know. So it's not about doom and gloom. It's the reality, really.
I think, okay, maybe this is the last question. Or we... Okay, yeah. This is the last question.
Sorry, we're both Parthasarthi. I teach media policy at Jamia Millia. There's an observation and then there is a question. Yeah. So the observation is what is interesting across all the speakers is that you sort of identified different kind of flashpoints where things have taken a turn for the worst. If I go backwards, so quite clearly the pandemic and perhaps things which happened at that time was one kind of flashpoint. From what you were saying, Sukumar, clearly the ingress of online interactions seems to be a flashpoint for a certain kind of phenomena which might have existed earlier on. Yeah. From what I think Bharat was saying, clearly what was happening at a moment between the mid-80s and the mid-90s was a kind of flashpoint here. And I've been therefore wondering whether these flashpoints over a period of time, say 40 years, to what extent is their impact incremental, or is it the fact that one of them tends to enhance the shaky ground already created by the previous one? Because then, in a sense, this kind of periodization goes across regimes, yeah. Okay, and while regimes do have a very important role to play, the flashpoint that you mentioned here, in a sense, seem to be agnostic to some extent to regimes, as understood in the formal sense. Yeah. So that's the kind of observation which I have and would want your views on that. The question, of course, is a little bit linked to that, is that what would you say is the fundamental difference between the Godi media of today and the Godi media of the yesteryears? Yeah.
Godi media of yesteryears was limited. In Times of India, you could say, oh, X is, he writes pro-Congress stories. Why? He is the stenographer of Ministry of External Affairs in the Hindu, for example. Okay, so they were limited. Today's Godi media is everybody's, even those who would want to write differently and unable to write also get clubbed together. And then the number has grown. Number of people who are actually willing and eager to do government plants, it's grown tremendously. Whether it's out of fear, whether it's out of, I don't know, hope, some hope for getting something from the government, God alone knows. But the size has grown and the prevalence has grown.
Not just prevalence, it's the sheer pride of being Godi media, you know. I mean, there are number of people who are sort of dying to click a picture with the Prime Minister and then post it on the social media and retweet it. Is just phenomenal. These are normal journalists. I mean, they were not part of Godi media till yesterday, but they are now, you know.
If I can just recall one particular incident tells you what the difference between then and now. Even in Vajpayee's time, in Orissa there was a famine, and Vajpayee had called. There was a meeting of Editors Guild with Vajpayee, and one of the editors got up and said that people are dying in Kalahandi and they're eating mushrooms and sort of forest produce. What are you doing? Your food corporation godowns are overflowing with food grain. So Vajpayee thought for a while and said, "To kya kare? Free mein bant dein?" So this guy got up like this and stood up before him and said, "Why not? Free mein kyun nahi bante? Banto free mein." Now, can anybody say that today to anybody in the government? That's what has changed.
Another thing I want to tell you is that a fact or figures which never gain prominence is the number of people who, within the newsroom, who have lost their jobs. Yes. All those who made contrary noises, contrary to what the government wants to allow in the papers or even on TV channel, they all lose jobs, and I can assure you they never will get a job back again. There are no jobs for journalists. And once a settled journalist loses job, you look at the figures on CMIE, before the pandemic, there were some losses, but subsequently in the last 2-3 years, there have been a huge number of people who have gone away. Some people make a living by being Facebook journalists, but we're not talking about them. So it's a very dark, disturbing reality, and Godi media is also an act of survival because they know that there is no other thing that they can do in life. So if they find an option, they go away, but many of them lose jobs.
Okay, I think this is a... Okay, one, yeah, sure.
I'm Pankaj Naqvi. I agree with... I'm a lawyer by profession now. Forget about that. That's not the thing. Apart from the change of regime, is there not any other way out that we can bring about a change? A change of regime, I don't see in the near possibility.
Given all these flashpoints, which one do you think will remain despite a change in regime? To put the question in a very different way.
Maybe.
I can
but you see,
I can just button for shortly.
Floating a YouTube channel.
It has something to do with democracy. How is the democracy functioning? If you have political parties who are adversarial, who make noises, I think that is what gives protection to a journalist to speak his, come out with a story, write something. But when you have politics also on the slide, with the kind of savaging that takes place in the media and outside against political parties, look at the outcome. I'm sure it is horrible, the amount of money which has been found with the member of parliament, Mr. Sahu. It kind of delegitimizes politics in a large way. And there is no defense whatsoever coming in from the opposition or whatever. So every step that is taking place is not rescuing our democracy. So once you have something happening there, I'm sure media will also start kicking back.
I will say that, collective action by the fraternity. By the fraternity and prompt action or a prompt reaction to any action, I think is the best bet. And it may not work all the time. It may not work the way we want it to work, but it definitely softens the impact, or softens the blow that is being landed. So we have done this. We've seen this. IT rules is one example. They had initially come up with a notification that PIB will have that. There was a backlash. They withdrew that notification. Then they came up with another notification that there will be a fact-checking unit. Then we went to the court. The court is, let's see what the judgment comes through. There is great merit in taking up every blow that the state lands in whichever form and collectively putting up a front. I'm not as gloomy as you were saying that, is there all gloom? I don't think so. I think if we let gloom come upon us, there will be gloom. If we collectively find ways, whether through judiciary, whether through op-eds, collective op-eds, some other forum, I feel judiciary, of course, is by default the most effective forum where we can resort to. We may not get, and we are sort of at the mercy of the kind of bench we get. Some benches are far more amenable, some benches may not be. But in each instance, you will definitely end up getting more than what you would be left with otherwise. So short of regime change, I think collective action, concerted action, through multiple tools, you can at least protect that space more than we would be left with otherwise.
The other issue which I wanted to speak was about the non-access of the journalists to the Parliament House. Now, cannot organizations like Press Club do something in this regard?
I think we put up actions where Guild was there, Press Club was there.
We've all agitated.
We've all agitated, and again, it's one of those instances where a certain kind of control was being put in, and I don't think so it really made any difference at that time, but still, I mean, the government had to sort of respond to it.
It's not a sensitive government.
Yeah, we have to live with that. Okay, I think now we have really run over time. This is an issue that can really take up not just one session, but one day or maybe 2 days, and still we will be left with enough in more ways, because the dynamics is so complex and the imperatives are so diverse that are governing the space of media. So this is one in a many set of dialogues. We look forward to the report when it is made public. Thank you, Bharat. Thank you all the speakers for coming in today. We look forward to the report, and thank you IIC for organizing it. And thank you everybody for being a part of this evening.